Hey everyone. Our last lesson gave us a basic structure for how God provided salvation for humanity, though that salvation did not transform their hearts. We now want to see how these stories would affect the original hearers in Moses' day. God's deliverance and presence in the midst of an evil world would have given the Israelites confidence in their day, and should do the same for his people today.
Needless to say, we can be sure that Moses wrote about Noah's flood and the course of the new order to inform Israel of the facts of this period of primeval history. Yet his record is far too selective and oriented toward particular themes to think that this was all he had in mind. Moses wrote not just to report the past, but to guide Israel in his own day as well. We will unfold Moses' purpose by looking at three portions of Genesis chapter 6 verse 9 through chapter 11 verse 9. First, we will examine the original meaning of the flood narrative, and then we will turn to Moses' record of Noah's sons. And finally, we'll give attention to the original implications of the last portion of the primeval history, the defeat of Babel. Let's look first at the ways Moses related the flood of Noah to the experience of Israel in his day. To discern Moses' use of the flood narrative, we will look at two aspects of the story. First, the connections he established between the flood and the Exodus, and second, the implications of these connections for Israel. Moses established connections between the flood and his own day by portraying Noah in ways that closely resembled his own life and ministry. Now, to be sure, the lives of Noah and Moses were different in many ways, and these differences should not be ignored. Yet, it's also evident that Moses purposefully depicted Noah so that his Israelite readers would see Noah as a precursor or foreshadowing of Moses. There are at least 8 significant connections between Noah and Moses. In the first place, Moses drew a connection between himself and Noah in the motif of violence. You'll recall from Genesis chapter 6 verse 13 that Noah's flood came because the world was filled with violence. As Exodus chapters 1 and 2 make clear, the Egyptians had inflicted much violence on the people of Israel prior to the call of Moses. Moses' deliverance from Egypt came in response to the violence inflicted on the people of Israel. So the work both of Noah and of Moses was to deliver from violence. A second association appears in Moses' use of the term ark. The Hebrew word for Noah's ark throughout Genesis chapters 6 through 9 is tevah. Interestingly enough, the only other place where Moses used the term tevah was in Exodus chapter 2 verses 3 and 5. There he referred to the basket in which his mother placed him as an ark, or a tevah. Although Noah's ark was mammoth, while Moses' ark was very small, Moses pointed to the fact that both he and Noah had been delivered from watery deaths by means of an ark, or tevah. In the third place, the importance of divine covenants also establishes Noah as a precursor of Moses. As we have seen, according to Genesis chapter 6 verse 18 and chapter 9 verses 11 through 17, Noah entered into covenant with God on behalf of the entire human race. But of course, we know that one of Moses' primary services to Israel was to mediate a divine covenant. As Exodus chapters 19 through 24 illustrates so well, Moses was chosen to lead the people of Israel into a special covenant with Yahweh as they came to Mount Sinai. The central role of judgment through water also establishes a fourth connection between the two men. In Genesis chapters 6 through 9, God delivered Noah and his family by taking them safely through a flood that destroyed the wicked of the earth. And in much the same way, as Exodus chapters 13 through 15 tell us, Moses brought Israel out of Egypt by passing through the waters of the Red Sea, which waters in turn destroyed the army of the Egyptian oppressors. In the fifth place, God sent wind to drive back the waters in both the days of Noah and the days of Moses. As we have read, according to Genesis chapter 8 verse 1, God sent a wind to drive back the waters of Noah's flood. Similarly, according to Exodus chapter 14 verse 21, at the Red Sea, the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind. A sixth connection appears in the emphasis put on animals. As Genesis chapter 6 verse 19 tells us, God commanded Noah to bring animals into the ark. On no less than 4 occasions, the book of Exodus mentions the many animals that left Egypt with the Israelites. Just as God ordained for Noah to bring animals into the world of his day, God also ordained that Moses should bring animals into the promised land. Seventh, the theme of divine remembrance also joins Noah and Moses. You will recall that in Genesis chapter 8 verse 1, as the waters raged in the days of Noah, God acted on Noah's behalf because he remembered him. God had made a covenant with Noah that he would bring him safely through the flood, and he remembered that covenant. In much the same way, God declared to Moses that he delivered Israel from Egypt because he remembered his covenant. Listen to what God told Moses in Exodus chapter 6 verse 5. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Divine remembrance played a vital role in the flood and in the Exodus. Finally, the blessing of nature also associates Noah with Moses. Noah brought the human race into a new world where God promised there would be a lasting and stable natural order that would benefit humanity. In a similar fashion, Moses told Israel that in the land of promise, nature would remain constant and beneficial in much the same way. With these connections between Noah and Moses in mind, we are in a position to see the implications of these parallels for the nation of Israel. Why did Moses establish these connections? To grasp the original implications of this material, we must remember that the people of Israel had seriously rebelled against Moses, questioning his authority and the wisdom of his program of exodus and conquest. These challenges to his ministry led Moses to establish connections between himself and Noah. God had used Noah in the flood of deliverance to redeem humanity from horrible primeval violence and to reestablish the human race in a new world of great blessings. And in much the same way, God had chosen Moses to deliver Israel from the horrible violence of Egypt and to bring Israel into a new world of the promised land. Moses' design for Israel was so similar to the flood of Noah that no one could rightly deny it had come from the hand of God. Now that we have seen the original meaning of the flood of deliverance, we should turn to Moses' record of the sons of Noah in Genesis chapter 9 verse 18 through chapter 10 verse 32. Why did Moses include this material in his primeval history? What was his purpose in bringing these matters to Israel's attention? To examine this portion of Moses' record, we will look at 3 issues. First, his special focus on Canaan. Second, the theme of conflict. And third, the implication of these motifs for Israel. Consider first the way Moses gave attention to Canaan. You will recall that Noah awoke from his drunken sleep and realized that Ham had dishonored him and that Shem and Japheth had honored him. Now, it would only seem reasonable for Noah to have been angry with Ham and to have cursed him, just as he blessed his other sons. But this is not what happened. Listen to the entirety of what Noah said in Genesis chapter 9, verses 25 through 27. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth, and may Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave. As we see in this passage, Shem and Japheth received appropriate rewards for their righteousness, but Ham was not even mentioned here. Instead, it was Canaan, the son of Ham, who received Noah's curse. When we look carefully at this story, we see that Ham serves a different role than his brothers. In short, Ham has little significance apart from the fact that he was the father of Canaan. Notice the way Moses wrote of Ham in this narrative. In chapter 9, verse 18, we read, "The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan." The same identification appears in chapter 9, verse 22 as well. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness. In many respects, Ham fades into the background of this story, and his son Canaan takes his place alongside Shem and Japheth. With Moses' special emphasis on Canaan in mind, we may turn to a second concern that appears in his treatment of the sons of Noah: conflict in the new order after the flood. The theme of conflict plays a major role in Moses' attention to Noah's sons. To miss this theme is to miss the most important aspect of the story. The idea of conflict also appears in Genesis chapter 9, verses 25 through 27. "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave." Notice how Moses stressed the certainty of conflict by repeating Canaan's curse 3 times in this passage. In verse 25, he pronounced the curse that Canaan would be the lowest of slaves, or the lowest kind of slave imaginable. In verse 26, Noah predicted that Canaan would be the slave of Shem. And in verse 27, Moses added that Canaan would become Japheth's slave as well. Through this repetition, Moses stressed the fact that Canaan would certainly be conquered by his brothers. Beyond this, it's important to note that these verses portray Shem as the principal victor over Canaan. In verse 27, the words, "May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave," may be better translated, "May Japheth live in the tents of Shem so that Canaan may be his slave." Noah's idea seems to be that Canaan will become subservient to Japheth only to the extent that Japheth joined forces with Shem. In effect, Moses believed that Shem was to take the lead in subjugating Canaan. So we see in this passage that Moses established an important feature of the new order after the flood, which could hardly have been expected. He understood that the future of humanity would entail a dramatic conflict in which the descendants of Shem would subjugate the descendants of Canaan. In light of Moses' attention to Canaan and the theme of conflict, we're able to see the original implications of Noah's sons for ancient Israel. Why did Moses include these events in his record of the new order after the flood? Well, Moses had a very specific reason for describing the new order in this way. The conflict between Shem and Canaan spoke directly to the needs of his Israelite audience. It addressed a crucial dimension of their lives. The key to understanding Moses' purpose appears in Genesis chapter 10, verses 18 through 19. After listing some of the descendants of Canaan, Moses wrote that later the Canaanite clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon toward Gerar as far as Gaza, and then toward Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. These rather specific geographical references were familiar to Moses' Israelite readers. The descendants of Canaan, or the Canaanites, had settled in the region that stretched north to south from Sidon to Gaza, and to the region of Sodom and Gomorrah. Moses was especially concerned with those descendants of Canaan who had settled in the Promised Land. As the Shemite nation specially called by God, the people of Israel were to move into this land of the Canaanites and to claim it as their own. So we see that Moses' account of the sons of Noah was not simply designed to give an account of the past. It was designed to give a background to Moses' call to Israel to move forward into the conquest, just as God had ordained in the primeval history. As a result, the Israelites who resisted Moses' call to take the land of Canaan were not simply resisting Moses. They were actually resisting the plan of God, the order that God had established for the world after the flood. Now that we have seen how the accounts of the flood and Noah's sons apply to the original Israelite readers, we should turn to our third focus, Moses' original intention when writing about the defeat of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. To grasp how Moses wanted the Israelites to apply the story of Babel's defeat to their lives, we will look into three aspects of this passage. First, Moses' description of the city. Second, his description of Yahweh's victory. And third, the implications for the Israelites as they moved toward the Promised Land. Let's look first at the description of the city. We should note that the name of the city, Babel, corresponds to the city which later came to be known as Babylon. By the time of Moses, the city of Babylon was well known in the ancient Near East. It had been a center of civilization for many years, and its reputation had reached mythic proportions. So when Moses wrote about a place called Babel after the flood, his Israelite readers would have immediately recognized this place as the primeval origin of a great urban center. A second important aspect of Genesis chapter 11 verses 1 through 9 is the way in which Moses described Yahweh's victory over this great primeval city. At several points in his story, Moses displayed the grandeur of God's victory by contrasting the outlooks of the inhabitants of Babel with his own true outlook. For example, consider the way Moses handled the theme of scattering, or in Hebrew, the verb putz. On the one hand, the inhabitants of Babel were deeply concerned with the possibility that they might be scattered. In chapter 11, verse 4, we find that they built the city so that they may not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But by contrast, Moses reported twice that God did precisely what the people of Babel did not want to happen. In chapter 11, verse 8, we read that the Lord scattered them over all the earth. And again, in chapter 11, verse 9, we find that from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Frequently in the Old Testament, the term scatter has the very negative connotation of utter defeat in battle. Defeated soldiers are scattered as their enemies chase them away, slaughtering them as they flee. And this is the connotation in this story as well. Moses presented this story as an account of an astonishing victory for Yahweh. Yahweh called his heavenly host to war against the city of Babel and to chase away its fleeing inhabitants across the face of the earth. Another way in which Moses contrasted his outlook with that of the inhabitants of Babel was with respect to the size of the city and its tower. According to Genesis chapter 11, verse 4, the inhabitants of Babel wanted a tower that reached to the heavens, the place of their gods. But Moses scoffed at this idea. Instead, in Genesis chapter 11, verse 5, he wrote that the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Hebrew word yarad, which is here translated came down, has a rather specific connotation in this story. God did not simply notice the city. He did not even simply come to the city. Instead, whereas the inhabitants of Babel wanted to build a tower that reached to the heavens, Moses insisted that Yahweh had to come down from the heights of heaven just to see the city. So we see that Moses jeered at the pretense of the inhabitants of Babel. From Yahweh's point of view, this city was little more than a tiny speck. Finally, we should note how the defeat of Babel led Moses to deride the reputation of this primeval city. The inhabitants of the city called it Babel. In the languages of Mesopotamia, the term Babel meant the gate of God. This name expressed the belief that their ziggurat actually formed a gateway to the gods, and that they were secured by the powers of heaven. But Moses had a different viewpoint on the name of the city. Since Yahweh had severely defeated Babel, the city was clearly not the gate of God. So, what then did the name mean? Moses' strikingly sarcastic answer appears in Genesis chapter 11, verse 9. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. To understand Moses' sarcasm in this verse, we need to understand how he played with the sounds of two Hebrew words. First he said, that is why it was called Babel. The Hebrew word for Babel is simply Bavel, a Hebrew version of what the Mesopotamians called that place. But then Moses explained that the city had this name because the Lord confused human language there. The Hebrew word translated confused is balal, which sounds similar enough to Bavel in Hebrew that Moses' sarcasm worked. He reviled the ancient city by saying that the real reason it was called Babel was because of balal, or confusion, that took place there. So from Moses' point of view, the name Babel was appropriate for this place, not because it was the gate of God, but because it was a place of confusion for the whole world. Through this sarcasm, Moses utterly reversed the awesome reputation that Babel had in his day. He led the Israelites in delightful laughter as he told them that the victory of their God Yahweh had made a joke out of the greatest city of primeval history. With the description of the city and Yahweh's victory in mind, we are in a position to see the implications of this story for the people of Israel as they moved toward the Promised Land. As we know, at Kadesh Barnea, Moses sent spies into the land of Canaan who returned with bad reports. They claimed that Israel could not conquer the land of Canaan because the forces there were too great. As a result, the Israelites turned away from the conquest and spent the next 40 years wandering in the wilderness. It was only when the next generation came to adulthood that Moses was ready to move Israel against Canaan once again. One aspect of these bad reports helps us understand the significance of the defeat of primeval Babel. Listen to what the spies said about the cities of Canaan, as reported in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 28. The people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large, with walls up to the sky. Unfortunately, most modern translations of this verse fail to draw the connection between this description of the Canaanite cities and the Tower of Babel. When the spies spoke of walls up to the sky, the term for sky is the Hebrew word shamayim, which is often translated heaven. In fact, it's the same term used about the Tower of Babel when it is described as a tower that reaches to the heavens in Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. In both cases, the idea was that the cities were invincible because they had reached the heights of heaven. So it is that Moses drew a connection between the primeval city of Babel and the cities of Canaan. The Israelites thought that the walls surrounding the cities of Canaan reached to heaven, much like those who built the tower at Babel thought that their ziggurat had reached heaven. And this connection between the city of Babel and the cities of Canaan brings Moses' purpose to light. Put simply, the Canaanite cities before the people of Israel may have seemed to reach to heaven, but they were still no match for the power of Yahweh. In the primeval days, Yahweh moved against the greatest city known to humanity, whose tower supposedly reached to heaven as well. Yet this primeval city, which was greater than any city of Canaan, was easily destroyed by Yahweh. Just as God had delivered the human race into a new order through the primeval flood, he had delivered Israel from Egypt. And just as God had ordained conflict between Shem and Canaan, Moses was leading Israel toward the land of the Canaanites. And just as God defeated the great city of Babel, he would soon give victory to Israel against the cities of Canaan. From these chapters of the primeval history, the people of Israel should have understood that to follow Moses toward the promised land was to move in the right direction. So far, we have seen the literary structure and original meaning of Moses' record of Genesis chapter 6, verse 9 through chapter 11, verse 9. Now we are ready to ask a third question. What are some of the ways we should apply this material to our lives today?
Hopefully, this lesson helped to make some of the more obscure passages in this section click for you. Understanding this context gives meaning for some of those stories that might not seem directly applicable to us today. Now we want to take some time to see how this information may apply to us now. Our first question is this: what does it mean to you that God is a God of deliverance? Please pause to discuss. Our second question is this: how do you think God deals with wicked societies in today's culture? Please pause now to discuss. We hope your time in reflection on this lesson will draw you closer to the same God who has always shown his love for us.